Samuel was a young man who lived in Benin City, Nigeria. At just 23 years old, he owned one of the most popular barbing shops in the city. Everyone who needed a haircut came to him. His skills with clippers was unmatched, and his shop was always busy, with a long line of customers waiting for their turn. People often talked about how clean and sharp his haircuts looked. They would leave his shop feeling like new people, ready to face the world with confidence. But behind all the praise and attention Samuel received for his incredible work, there was a secret that no one knew, a secret that Samuel had been hiding for a long time. No one suspected that the reason for his success wasn't just his talent with a clipper. The real reason was something much darker, something that no one could even imagine. Hello everyone, my name is Adaugo and you're watching the African Tales channel by Adaugo. Before we dive into this video, please kindly click under the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you will be notified whenever I upload a new video. Now, let's get into the story. Samuel had a hidden part of his shop. Down in the back corner where no one could see, he had dug a deep hole in the ground. This hole was no ordinary hole. It was the resting place of a human head. Yes, a human head. Samuel had buried it there, believing it would bring him customers and make him the best barber in town. It was a secret he could never share with anyone. And as long as no one knew, the head would continue to work its strange magic. At first, Samuel had been afraid. He didn't want to touch something so evil. But after he buried the head, things started to change. His customers increased. People from all over the city came to his shop, not just for the quality of his work, but because something about Samuel's shop seemed special, something that made them feel drawn to it. They didn't know why they felt that way. They just knew that Samuel's barbing shop was different from every other one in the city. One day, a curious boy named Obinna came into the shop. Obinna had heard the rumors about Samuel's skills, but he was also a little nervous. He had heard that Samuel's shop was full of strange happenings, that people would come in and some would leave looking more scared than when they walked in. Obinna didn't believe the stories, but he was still curious. He had to find out for himself. As Obinna sat in the chair, Samuel noticed the boy's nervousness. It wasn't something Samuel usually saw in his customers. Most of the time, people came in full of excitement, eager to get their haircuts. But Obinna was different. Samuel, who never spoke about the secret of his success, suddenly felt the weight of the head under the ground in the back of his mind. He had to remind himself that he couldn't let anyone know what lay hidden beneath his shop. The sound of the clippers buzzing was like music in the quiet room. But Samuel couldn't stop thinking about the boy. What if Obinna discovered the secret? What if he started asking too many questions? He had to be careful. The door to the shop opened and another customer walked in. Samuel turned his head just for a moment, but when he looked back at Obinna, something strange happened. The boy's eyes were closed and his face looked pale, almost lifeless. Samuel froze. The clipper stopped buzzing and the room became eerily silent. Obinna's head jerked up and he stared at Samuel with wide eyes. It was as if something had taken over him. "There is something down there, isn't there?" Obinna whispered, pointing towards the back corner of the room. "Something that's making everything work. I can feel it." Samuel's heart raced. How did the boy know? He had never told anyone, not even his closest friends. The thought of the head being exposed terrified him, but he couldn't let Obinna know the truth. "Obinna, you must be imagining things," Samuel said, trying to keep his voice steady. "There is nothing there." But Obinna was not convinced. His eyes narrowed and he shook his head. "I know what I felt," he said, his voice trembling. "I felt it when I walked in here. This shop is cursed, isn't it?" Samuel's hands shook as he tried to finish the haircut. But Obinna wasn't the only one who had started to feel the strange energy in the shop. Other customers had started to notice it too. They couldn't explain it, but they felt drawn to Samuel's shop in a way that was hard to describe. Some of them even started to feel uneasy, as if something was watching them. They couldn't put their finger on it, but something was off. The more Samuel thought about it, the more he began to question whether the secret he had buried deep within the ground was truly the source of his success, or if it was something else. Could the head have powers beyond his understanding? Powers that would soon come to claim him if he wasn't careful? The days went on, and Samuel's shop continued to thrive. But with every passing day, the feeling of dread grew stronger. People came in and some of them never came back. Some of them were never seen again. Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming for him. Something that would make him regret ever digging that hole. One night, as Samuel closed his shop and prepared to go home, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The door to his shop creaked open, even though he was sure he had locked it. A shadow moved across the floor, and then, in the flickering light of the street lamp outside, Samuel saw the figure of a person standing in the doorway. But when he looked closer, he realized there was something strange about the person. It was Obinna, but his eyes were glowing, and his face had changed. It was like he wasn't the same person anymore. "You should have never buried that head," Obinna whispered, his voice not his own. "Now you must pay the price." Samuel froze in terror as the lights flickered, and the temperature in the room dropped. The air became thick and heavy, and he realized that the real price of his success was coming for him. The air grew colder as Obinna's glowing eyes locked onto Samuel. The young barber's heart raced in his chest. He tried to move, but his feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The figure standing in the doorway wasn't just Obinna anymore. It was something far more sinister. "You've disturbed something you can't control," Obinna's voice echoed. But it was no longer the voice of the boy Samuel had met that afternoon. It was deeper, darker, almost like it came from the ground itself. Samuel's mind raced. The head, it wasn't just a simple trick. It was powerful, too powerful. The thought of what he had done, the secret he had kept, now seemed like a mistake he could never undo. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," Samuel whispered, his voice shaky. His hands were sweating and his stomach twisted with fear. "I just needed a way to make my shop succeed. I never wanted this." Obinna's figure in the doorway seemed to grow taller. His body stretched unnaturally. The shadow of the figure merged with the dark corners of the room. "You don't get to decide when things stop," Obinna said with a smile that was not his own. "Once the head is buried, it owns you. It owns everything." Samuel's pulse quickened and he felt a cold shiver run through his spine. "Please," he begged, "I will fix it. I will dig it up and—" "You can't undo it," the voice interrupted. Now a low, ominous growl. "It's already started. You've made your choice, Samuel, and the head is not the only one who will be watching." Samuel's breath hitched in his throat. He turned his eyes towards the back of the shop, the corner where the hole was buried. It felt as if something was pulling him, dragging him towards it. The urge to run was overwhelming, but his legs refused to move. Then, without warning, a loud crashing sound echoed from the back of the shop. The ground beneath Samuel's feet shook violently, and the floorboards creaked under the weight of something enormous. The shop was alive, like it had turned into a creature, an ancient evil force with a mind of its own. "Get out!" Samuel screamed, shaking his head. "This is my shop, my work. Leave me alone." But the air around him grew heavier, and the light from the street lamp outside flickered once more. The shadow of Obinna disappeared, leaving only a cold, empty space in the doorway. Samuel didn't know what to do. He ran towards the back of the shop, his mind clouded with panic. He had to undo this. He had to destroy whatever cause he had unknowingly set in motion. When Samuel reached the corner of the shop, he stopped short. The floor where he had buried the head was no longer solid. It was cracked open, like the earth was swallowing itself. The soil shifted and moved as if it had a life of its own. And there it was, the human head, half buried, half exposed, stared up at Samuel with wide, unblinking eyes. Its mouth moved as if it were trying to speak, but no words came out. The head wasn't decayed or rotten. Instead, it looked fresh, as if it had just been placed there moments ago. Samuel stumbled backward, his stomach turning. This wasn't just some simple curse. It was something far worse. The head was alive and it wasn't alone. From the shadows, figures began to emerge. Other heads, half-formed bodies and twisted shapes began to crawl out of the cracks in the floor. Their eyes glowed with the same eerie light that had once come from Obinna. They surrounded Samuel, their mouths opening, whispering a language he couldn't understand. Samuel's hand trembled as he tried to think of a way out, but the whispering grew louder, drowning out his thoughts. The voices sounded familiar, like the voices of customers who had entered his shop and never returned. Were they the souls of the people who had walked in only to vanish after their haircuts? Were they trapped here, feeding the curse? The last of the figures stepped forward, a woman with hollow eyes and a cold, empty smile. Samuel couldn't breathe as she raised her hand and pointed directly at him. "You've unleashed us, Samuel," she said, her voice chilling. "And now you will pay the price." Samuel felt a wave of terror wash over him. This wasn't just a curse. This was a punishment. He had been too greedy, too desperate for success. And now it was too late. He had disturbed something that could never be put back into the ground. Suddenly, he heard a loud crash from the front of the shop. The door burst open and a new customer walked in. But when Samuel looked up, he realized it wasn't just any customer. It was someone he had seen before. It was Obinna, but not the same boy he had met earlier. This Obinna was different. He was dressed in dark clothing, his face expressionless. The glowing eyes returned, but they were even more intense than before. "You can't run away from this, Samuel," Obinna said. "You made your choice when you buried that head, and now you must serve it." Samuel couldn't speak. He felt trapped. His shop, his life, his future, it was all slipping away, consumed by the cause he had set in motion. There was no way out. But then, in a flash of clarity, something inside Samuel snapped. He had to make it right. He couldn't let this be the end of him. There had to be a way to fight back. "Leave me alone!" Samuel shouted, his voice filled with newfound strength. He reached for the nearest object, a broken mirror on the counter, and threw it at the figures surrounding him. The mirror shattered with a deafening sound, and the figures recoiled, their forms flickering as if they were losing their hold on reality. The curse was fighting back, but Samuel wasn't done. He wasn't giving up. But as he looked down at the broken mirror, he realized something chilling. The reflection staring back at him wasn't his own. It was the reflection of the head. Samuel froze, staring at the broken mirror in disbelief. The reflection that stared back at him wasn't his own. It was the head, the very same head he had buried in the corner of his shop. Its eyes were wide open, unblinking, and it seemed to be watching him. A cold, bone-chilling smile curled across its lips, as if mocking him. The air grew even colder, and the whispers from the shadows grew louder, more frantic. Samuel could feel the presence of something ancient and evil closing in on him. It was as if the entire shop had come to life, like the walls, the floor, the very ground beneath him was alive and hungry. "You can't escape us," the head's reflection whispered through the broken mirror. "You will never escape." Samuel's heart raced and his legs shook beneath him. He could feel the cursed energy of the head pulling him closer to it, as if the very earth was trying to drag him down into the ground, into the grave with it. His hands trembled, but he forced himself to focus. He couldn't let fear take over. He had to find a way to break the curse. He turned away from the mirror, hoping to escape the chilling reflection. But as he did, he noticed something strange. Obinna, the boy who had come into the shop earlier, was no longer standing in the doorway. He was standing behind Samuel, his eyes glowing with that same eerie light. "You can't stop it," Obinna said, his voice no longer his own. "You have already called it. Now it controls you." The ground beneath his feet trembled again, and the shadows in the shop seemed to grow longer, more alive. The head in the corner stared, its mouth opening wider, its smile stretching into something even more terrifying. Samuel realized with horror that the curse wasn't just about the head, it was about control. It was controlling the shop, the people who came in, and even Obinna. Obinna's figure flickered, shifting as though he wasn't entirely human anymore. He seemed to be merging with the darkness in the shop, becoming part of the curse. His voice echoed in Samuel's mind. "The more you resist, the stronger it gets. It wants to claim you just like it claimed me." Samuel felt the weight of those words in his chest. He wasn't just fighting to break a curse. He was fighting to keep his soul from being consumed by the evil that had taken hold of the shop. He glanced around, desperate for something, anything that could help him. That's when his eyes landed on the old mirror, shattered and broken, reflecting the cursed figure of the head. He noticed something that hadn't been there before, a crack running through the glass. The crack seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as though it were alive, waiting for the right moment. Samuel's thoughts began to clear. He knew now what he had to do. The mirror, it was the key. He couldn't destroy the curse with violence or force, but he could trap it. He could use the reflection to turn the curse against itself. With every ounce of strength he had, Samuel lunged forward and grabbed a shard of the broken mirror. The sharp edges bit into his hand, but he didn't care. He had to act fast. The ground trembled once more, and the cursed figures began to move closer, closing in on him. The whispers grew louder, but Samuel fought against the fear. He held the shard of the glass up, focusing all his energy on the reflection of the head. The moment the shard touched the reflection, a flash of light exploded from the mirror. The entire room seemed to spin, and the air thickened, growing heavier and suffocating. Samuel fell to his knees, the shard still clutched in his hand, his heart racing. For a moment, everything went silent. Then something strange happened. The shadowy figures, the whispers, the evil presence, it all began to retreat. The cursed energy seemed to pull away, as though it was being sucked back into the mirror. The head's reflection twisted and screamed in pain, its smile fading into a grimace of agony. Samuel watched in awe as the mirror began to glow with an intense blinding light. It was like the curse was unraveling before his eyes, the power of the head being undone by the very reflection that had started it all. But just as the light reached its peak, something dark and dangerous flickered in the corners of the room. "Do you really think you've won?" A voice groaned from the shadows. It was the voice of the head, no longer in the mirror, but coming from the deep within the shop. From the very walls. "You think you can banish me so easily? You have no idea what you've unleashed." The ground shook violently and the lights flickered. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest as he realized that the curse was far from over. It was fighting back, and this time it was stronger than ever. Suddenly, Obinna lunged at him, his hands reaching for Samuel's throat. His face was twisted, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "You can't escape me, Samuel," Obinna hissed. "You are mine now." Samuel struggled to break free, but the grip on his neck was like iron. He gasped for air, his vision starting to fade. This wasn't the same boy who had come into his shop. Obinna was gone, replaced by something much darker. But just as Obinna tightened his grip, a loud crash echoed through the shop. The door flung open and a figure appeared in the doorway. A tall, shadowy figure with glowing eyes. It was a man, but not just any man. This was someone Samuel recognized. It was his father. Samuel's breath caught in the throat as he saw the figure standing in the doorway. It couldn't be, could it? The man who had appeared was tall, dressed in old faded clothes. His eyes glowed faintly, just like Obinna's. But there was something familiar about him, something that made Samuel's heart race. "Father!" Samuel whispered, his voice shaky. The man in the doorway didn't respond immediately. His eyes, glowing with a dark intensity, scanned the room as if he were assessing the situation. Then his lip parted in a slow smile. "Yes, Samuel," he said, his voice deep and filled with an eerie calm. "It's me." Samuel's mind spun, his thoughts a blur. How could his father be here? The man standing before him wasn't the man he remembered. This figure, this shadow, was something else, something twisted by the darkness that had claimed the shop. The father Samuel had known was long gone. What stood in front of him was a man consumed by the curse, just like Obinna. The pressure on Samuel's throat loosened and Obinna stepped back, his glowing eyes narrowing in confusion. He seemed to recognize the figure as well, but there was a hint of fear in his expression. "You!" Obinna whispered. "You shouldn't be here." The man who claimed to be Samuel's father stepped into the shop, his presence filling the room with an unnatural weight. "I've been watching," he said, his voice steady. "You thought you could control it, but you were never in charge. You never understood the power you unleashed." Samuel's leg felt weak beneath him, but he managed to stand. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are you talking about?" You're my father, right?" The figure nodded slowly, but his eyes glowed with an unsettling light. "I am," he said, "but I am also something else now. Something you've made me." Samuel's heart pounded in his chest as the weight of those words sank in. The curse wasn't just in the shop, it was in his bloodline. His father had been part of this darkness long before Samuel had ever discovered the human head buried in the floor.